When you picture a Neanderthal, what do you see? For decades, we've all had the same image in our heads, a primitive, brutish figure, silent except for the occasional grunt. The classic caveman, more about the club in his hand than the thoughts in his head. For 100 years, science basically painted a portrait of a species that was a failed experiment, an evolutionary dead end whose silence was just a sign of its simplicity. The evidence is now so strong it's almost impossible to ignore. Neanderthals could speak. And for the first time, scientists are piecing together their vocal cords, their hearing, and their biology to figure out what they might have actually sounded like and what they might have said. Language was the bright line that separated us from them. But that entire picture, built on old bones and assumptions, was about to be completely shattered. It's time to rethink everything you thought you knew about humanity's closest and most misunderstood cousin. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe for more mind-blowing stories about our ancient past. You won't believe what our extinct cousins might have been capable of. And Dennis Krellin looked at the Neanderthal throat and concluded it was built all wrong. They argued the Neanderthal larynx, their voice box, sat high up in the neck, kind of like a chimp's or a human baby's. A high larynx doesn't leave much room for the pharynx, the space right above it that we use to shape and modify sounds. A tiny pharynx means you can't make a wide range of vowel sounds. So, based on this model, they said Neanderthals couldn't produce the full suite of sounds needed for real speech. Their vocalizations would have been slow, nasally, and just wouldn't have the clarity of a true language. The takeaway was pretty stark. Neanderthals didn't have the right hardware for speech, and this might be why they vanished while we, the big talkers, took over the world. Something in between, could it be? A Neanderthal? And if so, what were they saying? Imagine walking through a dense Ice Age forest and hearing a voice, not human, not animal. For a long time, the scientific community was right there with them. The whole debate over whether Neanderthals could talk has been one of the biggest arguments in human evolution. The first reconstructions, back in the early 1900s, were based on skeletons of old, arthritic individuals, which led to a picture of a stooped, ape-like brute. A flood of new evidence, from anatomy to genetics, is revealing a truth that collapses the distance between us and them. The grunting Neanderthal is such a powerful cliché, but it wasn't just Hollywood that got it wrong. The main argument against Neanderthal speech came down to anatomy. Back in the 70s, scientists like Philip Lieberman, for decades, that was the story. Neanderthals were smart hunters, sure, but they were trapped in a silent world, their thoughts locked away without a voice. The first crack in the wall of Neanderthal silence didn't come from a big new theory, but from one tiny bone. In 1989, in a place called Kebara Cave in Israel, archaeologists found an incredible 60,000-year-old Neanderthal skeleton. And tucked away in its throat was something almost never found, a hyoid bone. Using micro-CT scanners and complex computer models, a team led by Stephen Rowe looked at the fossil's internal structure. Your bones actually change throughout your life based on the stress they're put under. So, the inside of a bone is like a diary of how it was used. The team found that the internal structure of the Neanderthal hyoid was identical to ours, meaning it was being used in the exact same way to handle the stresses of speech. This wasn't just about shape anymore, it was about function. The evidence was becoming undeniable. Neanderthals had the hardware to speak. The hyoid is a small, U-shaped bone that anchors the tongue and larynx. It's the only bone in your body not connected to any other, and it's absolutely critical for talking. The Kebara hyoid changed everything. It wasn't shaped like a chimp's. For all practical purposes, it looked exactly like a modern human's. This was a huge hint that the whole anatomical argument might be wrong. If the bony foundation was the same, maybe the rest of the vocal parts were too. Of course, critics rightly pointed out that a pig's hyoid also looks surprisingly human. But the door was now open, so scientists went back to that bone with 21st century tech. But could they hear what they were saying? Speech is useless if no one can understand the subtle differences between sounds. Here again, technology gave us an answer. A team led by Mercedes Valverde used high-res CT scans to build 3D models of Neanderthal ear bones. They fed this data into a model to figure out what frequencies Neanderthals could hear best. The results were stunning. The Neanderthal hearing range was almost a perfect match for ours, and it was most sensitive in the exact frequency range where we produce the sounds of our own speech. There is no evolutionary reason for your hearing to be tuned that way unless you re-listening to speech. Even better, the study showed their hearing was optimized for consonants. Vowels give speech volume, but consonant sounds like P, T, and K are what carry most of the actual information. The ability to tell AB from AP is vital for complex language. Earlier theories had missed this, but the new evidence from their ears suggested Neanderthals were built for a language just as complex as ours. The case was getting stronger, but for a lot of people, the final proof had to be in the DNA. For years, the assumption was that our version of FOX2 was a unique upgrade that gave us the gift of language. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome put that idea to the ultimate test. More recent studies have found subtle differences, not in the FOXP gene itself, but maybe in how it was controlled. For example, another gene called NOVA1, which is important for brain development, has a variant found only in modern humans that seems to affect vocalizations. So, while Neanderthals have the core genetic hardware for speech, Homo sapiens might have gotten a few extra software updates that fine-tuned our abilities. But the core finding holds up. The most famous gene tied to language was there, and it was active. And the result was another bombshell. Neanderthals had the exact same version of the FOXP gene that we do. This shared genetic toolkit strongly suggested that the capacity for complex speech wasn't new to Homo sapiens, but something we inherited from a common ancestor we shared with Neanderthals. Of course, it's never that simple. Language isn't about one gene. It's a huge network of hundreds or thousands of them. Language doesn't fossilize, words and grammar just disappear. So how do you find proof of language and the stuff Neanderthals left behind? You look for a ghost of language in the archaeological record, symbolic behavior, but a closer look is changing that picture. We now know Neanderthals did things that seem clearly symbolic. Think about their tools. They lived in brutal Ice Age landscapes, which means they had to plan, coordinate, and share information to survive. Can you really imagine a group of hunters successfully ambushing a massive bison, coordinating their movements on the fly with just grunts and gestures? It seems pretty unlikely. Their complex social lives almost demand an equally complex way to communicate. They were simply too smart to have lived in silence. They developed something called the Levallois technique, a really complicated way of preparing a rock core so you can strike off a perfect flake with one single blow. Trying to teach someone that just by showing them would be incredibly hard. A little verbal instruction hit it here, not there, it makes all the difference. In Spanish caves, they scratched designs on walls and splattered them with pigment. They collected weird objects like crystals and fossils that had no practical use but must have meant something to them. Most convincingly, they wore jewelry. We've found eagle talons with marks showing they were worn as pendants, and seashells pierced to be strung like beads, sometimes even colored with red ochre. These aren't just tools, they're personal statements about who you are. It's hard to imagine communicating ideas like that without some form of language. The ability to make one thing stand for something else, a carved line for a river, red paint for blood, a shell for identity, is the mental foundation of language. Words are just sounds that we all agree mean something. If you find symbols, you're probably looking at a mind that can handle language. For a long time, we didn't see much of this from Neanderthals. Beyond art, the sheer complexity of Neanderthal life screams for language, and then there's the hunting. Neanderthals were incredible cooperative hunters, taking down giants like mammoths and woolly rhinos. Okay, so the evidence is clear. They had the right body parts, the right genes, and the right social structure for language. So, what did they actually sound like? Using the same 3D computer models that helped figure out their hearing, scientists can now start to rebuild the Neanderthal voice. By putting together scans of their skulls, their hyoid bones, and models of human soft tissue, they can create a virtual Neanderthal vocal tract and see what sounds it could make. What emerges is both familiar and strange. The Neanderthal voice box was a bit higher than ours, and their vocal tract was shorter. But their nasal cavity was much, much bigger. They could make the basic A, I, and U sounds, but they might have had trouble with the really subtle distinctions. For example, some models suggest they might not have clearly differentiated between words like beat and bit. Their A sound might have sounded more like an A to us. So, you'd recognize it as speech, but it would have a slightly flatter, more foreign sound. These differences would have made their voice sound distinct. It likely had a more nasal quality than our voices do. Some researchers even think their voices might have been higher pitched than ours, but that's still up for debate. Maybe a bit more nasal with a different rhythm, coming from someone with bigger lungs who could speak in longer, more powerful phrases. It's the sound of another kind of human lost to time that we can finally, faintly begin to hear again. The biggest difference would have been in the vowels. Because their throat was shaped differently, their range of vowel sounds was probably a little different. But here's the cool part. What they might have lacked in vowels, they made up for with consonants. Just like their ears suggest, their language was likely packed with consonants. And that's a huge deal because consonants are what allow you to cram a ton of information into just a few sounds. A consonant-heavy language is fast, efficient, and complex. Imagine hearing that voice. It wouldn't be an ape's shriek or a monster's growl. It would be a human voice. Knowing they could talk is one thing. Knowing what they talked about that's the real mystery. Without a time machine, we'll never know their exact grammar or vocabulary. And there wasn't just *1 Neanderthal language. They were spread out from Spain to Siberia in small, isolated groups, so it's almost certain there were hundreds of different Neanderthal languages, maybe as different from each other as English is from Mandarin. We know this because of the most intimate connection possible. Our ancestors had children together. The proof is right there in the DNA of most people alive today who live outside of Africa. Somewhere between 1% and 4% of our DNA comes from Neanderthals. They saw a person, a partner. They formed bonds and raised families together. You would hear a voice. It might sound strange with a different pitch, and the words would be completely alien. But you would know it was language. You would see the same spark of awareness in their eyes that we have in ours. You wouldn't be meeting a caricature from a museum diorama. You would be meeting another kind of human. A cousin, yes, but a human all the same. That kind of relationship is almost impossible to imagine without some kind of communication. It may not have been a perfect translation, but they must have found enough common ground to share thoughts and feelings. Enough language to build trust, to form a bond, to see the human in each other's eyes. On some basic level, we could understand each other. And this wasn't just a one-time thing, it happened over and over again. Given their small, tight-knit communities, some linguists think their languages might have been incredibly complex in certain ways with huge vocabularies for the things that mattered to them, the animals they hunted, the plants they gathered, their tools, and their families. Some scientists look at their skulls and suggest their brains were wired a bit differently. Neanderthal brains were big, but it seems they dedicated more space to vision and controlling their powerful bodies, which makes sense for surviving in a dangerous world. This might have left less processing power for the kind of abstract thinking that is so central to our language. Their language would have been perfectly built for their world, a practical, powerful tool for staying alive. We grasp an idea, we waste time, we have a heavy heart. This trick of linking an abstract concept to a physical action might have been the big cognitive leap for Homo sapiens *. The fact that Neanderthal tools, while effective, barely changed for hundreds of thousands of years, and their art was rare and not very realistic, might point to a more literal mind. They could probably talk about the here and now with incredible precision, but maybe they didn't create vast, imagined worlds of gods, laws, and money, the stories that allow us to cooperate by the millions. Their conversations might have been about the mammoth hunt, not the mammoth spirit. But was it like our language in every single way? This is where it gets really interesting. The key difference might have been metaphor. We live on metaphors. For all the potential differences, the most powerful realization is how much we must have had in common. Just stop and think about what that really means. It means Neanderthals and Homo sapiens looked at each other and didn't just see a rival or an animal. So, if you could go back 50,000 years and meet a Neanderthal, you wouldn't hear a grunt. The story of Neanderthal language is really a story about us and our assumptions. We started with the silent, brutish caveman because maybe it made our own abilities feel more special and unique. We see them as they were, an intelligent, adaptable, and vocal species of human. Their voice may have sounded different, and their words may have focused on a more literal world, but they were part of the human chorus. Their extinction wasn't the end of a primitive grunt, but the loss of 1,000 unique languages and the stories they told. They are a powerful reminder that our definition of human is much broader than we ever thought, and that the silence of the past isn't empty, it's filled with voices we are only now, finally learning how to hear. But one by one, the facts have torn that old myth down. The evidence from their bones, their ears, their genes, and their artifacts all points in the same direction. Neanderthals spoke. They had a complex communication system they used to navigate their world, coordinate with each other, and share their lives. We may never know what their fireside chats were about, but we no longer see them as silent ghosts. If you found this journey into the lost voices of the past fascinating, please give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into science and history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Neanderthals talked about? What kind of stories do you think they told each other? Let us know below. Thanks for watching.